Hi there, my name's Geoff Ebbs and I'm here to talk about SDG12, Responsible Consumption and Production. So the very title of the SDG begs the question, who's responsible? Are we focused on the consumer or the producer? Now, if our house catches fire, we grab the kids and run. We save ourselves first, then our nearest and dearest. If there's time, we might grab a few precious memories as well. But as individuals in an emergency, we'd act in our own self-interest and then our families. When the world catches fire though, who do we save? Our neighbours, our city, the forest, the nation, civilization, or the planet? Some people take more responsibility for their actions than others. Now, there are 11 targets for SDG 12. Here the Irish government addresses 4 of them in this poster. Food waste is a target on its own. Fossil fuel subsidies is a part of remove market distortions that encourage wasteful consumption. And organic waste collection and recycling are both part of reducing waste generation. Domestic material consumption in the middle top there is one of the indicators for the target sustainable management of natural resources. So when we think about the things that are depicted here, you notice that 4 out of the 5 numbers that are given there are per capita. They're for each person. They talk about us as consumers. The fossil fuel subsidies are an action that government takes. And so there's no direct emphasis here on what the producers are doing. So industry is not called to account in this particular infographic. Now, one of those things that we just talked about is recycling. Recycling is a major focus around the world. This graphic's from Science Open, and the focus is nearly always on recycling the packaging of consumer products. Developed countries like Australia, where I'm from, send a lot of our recycled packaging to the global south for processing. And the implication or the outcome of that is that recycling is just rubbish. I wrote this article in 2007, and since then a lot of the statistics have got even worse. So recently Australians discovered that a lot of our recycling, the bulk of our recycling is sent overseas. Some of it's just been stored up in warehouse, and some of that stuff that has been stored in warehouses for so long has now started to be moved to landfill because we haven't found ways to recycle it. And the point about recycling is that it consumes almost as much energy as it does to make new material from raw products. So we might be mining less raw products or using less fossil fuel to make plastic, but we're using just as much energy to recreate the raw material and make another product from it. We need to shift to reusing and reducing our consumption of plastics, especially single-use plastics. So there's a limit to what we can do as consumers. We need to start to make producers responsible for the waste that they create. Renewable energy is an interesting one because that allows us to be both a producer and a consumer. So we can produce the energy on our solar panels on our roof, and then we consume less energy and reduce our emissions as we drive, cook and heat our homes. Of course, we're still consuming cars and appliances, and we're still demanding infrastructure. But for the first time, we're starting to become aware of how much energy we use. So a car battery can drive us about 500 kilometres in 5 hours, or it can power our whole family home for 3 days. So 5 hours of driving is about the equivalent of 3 hours of a whole family consuming energy at home. So we don't really think a lot about how much our transport, our mobility consumes in terms of energy. Nor do we think about how much our energy actually takes to produce. So here's a video produced by the Swedish Drama Society, and it shows a Olympic cyclist powering a toaster. The movie's not actually going to start for me, I don't think, so you just have to believe me that he works full speed for 2 minutes to actually cook a piece of toast. So there is someone using a huge amount of physical energy to make a piece of toast. So I've just said that the amount of energy we use at home is minuscule to the amount of energy we use driving around, but it's huge compared to the amount of energy we would use if we were doing things physically. So recycling is not very effective. Renewable energy on its own isn't a total answer. So let's have a think about where our emissions are coming from and what we are doing to correct them. So here are the top 5 emitters. Energy in dark blue at the top, industry in green, food and land use in pink, transportation in a deeper green, and the built environment in red there. Now, the right-hand side of the graph is the amount of emissions that these produce. So we can see that energy is the major source of emissions, and we are spending a lot of money in managing it, in transferring our energy from being burning stuff into capturing the energy of the sun. So that makes sense. Energy is largely physics with a bit of chemistry thrown in. We're actually using the laws of thermodynamics to move energy from one source to another. When we burn things, we're releasing the potential energy in the fuel and turning that into kinetic energy to turn a motor, which is then turned into electrical energy to power things. The other thing that we're spending a lot of money on is transportation, but we can see it's costing us a lot of money for a relatively small. Now, when I say relatively small, transportation is 17% of emissions, so it's not small by comparison with a lot of other things, but the amount of money we're spending on it is huge because transportation is quite difficult to change. Now, again, it's chemical and mechanical. It's not that complex. Industry is largely left alone, and that's mainly for political reasons. It's very hard for governments in capitalist countries to tell industry what to do. So we're not investing a huge amount in those things. Food and land use is really important, and we'll come to that at the end. Because food is very complex. Not only is it a biological process, but it's at the heart of a whole lot of social processes. So it was the Roman emperors had a saying that the role of government is to keep the price of corn or wheat cheap enough that the people will not revolt and high enough that the farmers will stay on the land. And that balancing act between making sure that there's enough food and that it's reasonably priced was a huge challenge for the Roman Empire and will become a more important challenge as we start to solve the energy and transportation problems. So this graph from Singapore-based Purpose Business was part of their advising Asian businesses on how to address the Sustainable Development Goals. And they are saying that we need to decouple economic growth from environmental degradation. So what that means is that as industry, as producers, we need to find ways, which means adopt technology, that allows us to continue to produce the value that we're providing to our consumers without harming the environment. So, good idea in, it's the basis of sustainable development. That's the only way we can have sustainability and development is through this kind of decoupling. But we need to think about it a bit more. So what we see here is that the top of the graph in the red zone is that we are not decreasing our footprint. We're not decreasing our emissions or our general environmental footprint. And so as our gross domestic product goes up, as we produce more stuff for more people, population increases and our affluence increases, so does our footprint. Now, even if we reduce our footprint a little bit, we are still going to be above the current emissions. We actually have to reduce our footprint a lot. We have to do a lot of technological wizardry to reduce our emissions, have negative growth in our emissions, while we are increasing population and while that population is demanding more stuff. Even that process of decreasing emissions a little bit is not decreasing them below the planetary boundaries. So we are still seeing climate chaos, biodiversity loss, disruption of water and nutrient cycles, ocean acidification, all of the other impact of crossing these planetary boundaries until we reduce our emissions and our footprint enough to bring our emissions and other damage that we're doing to the environment right down. So that's referred to here as sufficient absolute decoupling. So we have to decouple our economic growth and the harm that it causes sufficiently to reduce the harm that we do on the planet. So I locked Professor Ross Garnaut in the cage in 21 to interview him about his book Reset. Now, Professor Garnaut is responsible for the carbon tax that was brought in by the Australian government under Prime Minister Gillard, which actually reduced emissions for the approximately 6 months that it was in. So he is broadly seen as an advocate for addressing climate change. His book Reset says that we can produce sufficient technology to grow economically, and a lot of that growth will be in services rather than products and in creating more stuff, so that we can have economic growth and address our environmental issues. So he's a fervent arguer that we can decouple. Recently, in November 24, so a couple of months ago, as the director of the Superpower Institute, he produced a report showing that Australia could be making more money from green technology by 2060, so in 35 years, than it would be making from fossil fuels. So Australia is mainly an exporter of coal and iron ore, and what he's saying is that we could turn that around over the next 35 years and be a green economy. But he's recognised that that requires a huge amount of will. Now, in the last week, the Australian government has announced that it's not going to proceed with its Nature First policy because the shape of the international politics and the pressure on international trade means that governments everywhere are scared of upsetting the American government, which is fervently against all these net zero policies. So the political will to drive that decoupling that we've just looked at may not be there. Some academics and observers of the Sustainable Development Goals think that we should, as governments, and especially as a global government, just be putting a limit on consumption. Because one of the problems with the way that the SDGs have been working is that rich countries are refusing to compensate or support poorer countries who are feeling the greatest impact of climate change. And so there is a justice concern in the notion of sustainable production and consumption. A slight variation on that from this academic Alcott is that we should just be addressing impact. So we should be taxing or banning impact. Now, that's familiar to people like Ross Garnaut who have actually put a carbon tax on to reduce emissions. What we see here, though, is that the blue line is going down. That's the amount of emissions we are producing per the dollar of GDP. So over the last 20 years or so, that has decreased. We have become more efficient at producing stuff, at becoming more affluent while producing less energy. Now, the other things, our population, our affluence and our emissions have all gone up. And decoupling means that our emissions actually have to go down. Now, not only have they gone up over the last 20 years or so, but in the last 5 years, they have increased sharply. So we've stopped that long-term, decade-long drive for efficiency, and we have started to produce more quickly. So the idea of decoupling is actually getting harder, not only under the current political environment, but under recent economic development. So I've had a look at some of the things that we can do as consumers and how they might be limited. I've talked about the nature of decoupling and its importance in the responsible consumption and production. Now I want to move on to food. That's an area that I've been researching and working in more closely, and so I can talk in a bit more detail about the kind of things that we might do. Here we see a graphic from the Asia Development Bank, which is focused on food. 3 of the 4 pictures concern the production of food, and 1 is related to consumption. There's a good news story coming out of food, and that is about regenerative beef farming. So the regenerative production of red meat in particular has undergone a lot of thoughtful development, and it uses mimicking nature in a variety of ways to use animals to regenerate the soil, fertilise the soil, spread seeds around, and then moving the animals off before they harm the grassland on which they're eating. So this is mimicking the flow of bison across the American prairie or the large herds of animal across the African savanna. Very different than Australia's traditional way of managing land, which was largely through the use of fire. Nevertheless, it's having good results, especially when it's combined with replanting in gullies and so on to reduce the flow of water off the landscape and increase the flow of water into the soil. So not only is this approach to farming actually working and producing good results, it is now attracting the attention of big money, and so very, very large ranches in America or stations in Australia are adopting these practices and starting to have an impact on government policy. So here is an example of a nature-based approach to food production which is actually working. It's one of the few. So in a recent inquiry into food security, regenerative beef farming got a nod from the government, but grassroots community gardens, like this one that I've built in my complex of townhouses where I live in Queensland, Australia, did not get taken seriously by government. Government sees these kinds of grassroots community projects as being associated with welfare, as being the concern of local governments, and not being directly related to the food system. In fact, one of the community gardens that I've been involved with for some time, well, I did a precursor of this particular garden. I used to live in that block of flats through the trees and started a community garden on this plot. The Carilpa Commons is a much better organised and bigger group of people, and they've got a number of community gardens around Brisbane in Queensland, Australia. They are under threat by the police as we talk tonight. So the police have visited this weekend and the last weekend before. In the first case, they turned up with bulldozers, and they are trying to destroy this garden because it is not officially sanctioned by the government. So we have governments working against some of these grassroots movements. So it's worse than just ignoring them. So how do we deal with this? One of the organisations that I'm connected with is Food Connect. So here we see a group of people at the Food Connect shed discussing food systems and how we might improve them. Food Connect shed is owned by the community. It's a community asset. It's a community project to nurture and support food businesses and start to build food systems. It's about 6 years old. 500 people contributed to the purchase of the shed and keeping it going. There's a community mill there, there's an event space, which is where this picture is taken, and there's a couple of commercial kitchens and a whole lot of commercial cool rooms where food processors work to turn good food from farmers in the local area into food products and connect that into the system. Recently, the Food Connect Foundation had a summit, a food summit. The South East Queensland Food Summit was the official name of the event. And the purpose of that was to discuss this value chain coordination project. So the idea of Food Connect is that we want to connect these small-scale regenerative grassroots projects, regenerative farmers and other farmers who are concerned about the land and the quality of food, First Nation foods producers who are producing traditional grain or traditional foodstuffs. We want to connect all of these people into the food system. So this idea that small-scale grassroots things are not part of the food system needs to be overturned, and to overturn that we need to close the gap in what we call the missing middle. We need to connect all of these different people, including consumers, including small-scale producers, into the food system. And so one of the ways I like to describe this idea is that when we have something like a community garden, we are converting our home from being a node of consumption into making it a hub of production. And if we can connect those hubs of production into food hubs, like the Food Connect shed, then we can start to deal with institutions. So I've mentioned the food security inquiry by the Australian government. There were a lot of universities, hospitals and welfare institutions who said food is instrumental in taking a preventative approach to wellness. Food is instrumental in educating people and helping us understand things about biology and things about nutrition. And welfare agencies saying food is at the heart of community, and if we can give people good food and we can use food to bring people together, then we can overcome a lot of social challenges and problems. So these are institutions, prisons, hospitals, aged care facilities all use a lot of food, so those kind of institutions can be connected with these small-scale projects and start to make an impact on the overall food system. So that's the aim of Food Connect. That's what my university research is about, and this is one of the ways that we can start to connect production and consumption together and address the Sustainable Development Goals. So I've just spent a lot of time talking about the challenges that we have in addressing SDG12. I identified that food is very complex, it's a very difficult thing, but it's also essential. And because it is essential and because it is at the heart of a lot of the things we do, it is actually one area that gives us some hope. So, how do we work together to build the future? Our homes and our community can become hubs of production. We can share the joy of being a producer with neighbours, and that helps reduce the fear and overcome the negative role of the state. If people gather together and make it obvious to the government that they want to do these things, then the state will be less inclined to send the police around and bulldoze a garden because some neighbour complains. To do that, though, we need to connect the institutions who procure food and can support these projects to increase our reach and influence, because it's all very well doing things at a grassroots level, but unless they're having an impact on the systems, they're not going to make the change. And so we need to introduce wisdom into our practice to help decouple, degrow and decolonise, to go away from exploiting to regenerating, to go away from extracting, to go away from extracting to regenerating, and go away from exploiting to looking after each other. So that's been me, that's my presentation, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.